Alex, welcome to the Our Ability podcast. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to be here.
Tell me a little bit about who you are, your role, and why you're involved in disability advocacy.
I'm Alex Thompson. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the New York Association on Independent Living. We're a statewide membership organization of the independent living centers across New York State. There isn't necessarily, one independent living center per county. Some of the centers, cover larger geographic areas, but that's kind of who our members are. And their boards are majority people with disabilities. So we're all about peer peer advocacy, peer connections. We're part of this larger independent living movement, and that's kind of what drives my advocacy is the input from our members, from the disability community, and also being a part of the independent living movement, which is about people with disabilities being able to connect and support each other and living in the community and not um, not being institutionalized or sent into settings that are not integrated and sufficient to live a wonderful and fulfilling life.
Independent living movement has had a long history, and there's a lot of advocates with great stories that began this and led this and is part of this today. Do you ever reflect on your place in that and where we are in that sort of history of independent living movement?
Absolutely. When I first started working in independent living center, they had us do kind of an exercise, reviewing all the history and reading through a lot of that. And I was recently at the National Council on Independent Living conference in Washington D.C. and it's an interesting movement because a lot of the legends are still around. We've lost a few over the years, unfortunately, but there's still a lot of those significant change maker people, leaders in our movement who carry a lot of history behind them and have been a part of this are still around, and you can talk with them and connect with them as peers, which is just amazing. So anyone out there, if you run into someone, make a connection. See them on LinkedIn or Facebook. They're around.
Yeah, I got a chance to interview Judy Human on this podcast, and it was great and fantastic. But it also reminded me I needed to do a good job, not only just in the podcast, but obviously in disability advocacy, because those that came before us have done a great job, and we have to follow in their footsteps.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's that expression. I think you're standing on the shoulders of giants or something like that. It's yeah, and chronicling the history, which I appreciate what you're doing in terms of recording Judy, and Judy is one of many. We have a lot of those legends right here in New York. There's a lot of folks that are they were the director of the Independent Living Center since its beginning, or they're still on the board. There's a lot of folks that have kind of semi-retired. You can't always retire as an advocate. A lot of these people are kind of semi-retired, but they're still around and they're still involved, which is great.
So I've been reflecting a lot on the changes that have gone on in the last 6 months, both changes here in New York, but also federally, how it's going to impact people with disabilities, where we're going to go. And I'll tell you, there's moments where I get pretty discouraged, even just in the past, 4 weeks, having the subminimum wage federal regulation sort of be removed by the Trump administration, having the executive order 2 weeks ago, looking at institutionalization of people who are homeless, which we know where that's gonna lead. If you look at history in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and then also, in my world, the elimination of sort of litigating and looking at Section 503 of the Rehab Act, which asks federal contractors to have 7% of their employment base as people with disabilities. So you have, and I didn't even mention the Medicaid cuts coming in 2027. So you have benefits being cut. You have it harder to get benefits. You have employment services being cut. And now you're talking about reinstitutionalization of people who are on the streets under the guise of mental health issues, which is always the category that gets blamed whenever there's a shooting or some mass casualty event. We're on the precipice of something pretty negative. Am I wrong in thinking that, Alex?
Um, there are a lot of bad things happening. Yeah, I think in summary, and like you said, I think it's, there's certain attitudes and perceptions that need to be changed. I know we recognize that as advocates here in New York that we have a lot of education to do to keep doing. Because even in New York, there's a lot of talk about, changing the laws and standards around when can you institutionalize someone who is, in the subway system or on the street. And I think it's a difficult issue because people perceive, what they're seeing in the news and, what is happening in front of them. And they see people, that are unhoused, in their communities or, at bus stops. And yeah, it's an issue we need to address as a society. But I think we need to do a lot of education around what is the best way to do that in terms of not, you know, um, unfairly institutionalizing people.
How can we educate around that? I mean, if people, you would think those of us that have gone through education, undergrad, grad, whatever, high school, you should know the history of what happened in Nazi Germany. I realize it doesn't trickle down to the beginning of the disability part of that earlier than what history is telling. But how do we educate around that if people don't want to listen to what happened in our history?
I think even not even the history, even just understanding the way the system is now. I mean, I don't think a lot of people understand when the way a homeless shelter works is they're not necessarily a place to be during the day. A lot of these programs that, they come in, they get you up like crack of dawn, they put you out, and then, you got to be on a wait list or, you're got to be on some list to get back in the evening. And during the day, there's not really a lot of options for people to be somewhere. I think I don't think people necessarily understand some of that. I think there are organizations that are, changing those models, and there's a lot of enthusiasm around housing first models. And I'm not going to put myself out as an expert on that, but like when I was, doing my own research and talking with people, just here in the city of Albany, that work with some of that population, it is really eye opening that, that is kind of what's happening. I mean, there are people, at least I know in our community in Albany, there are people that, there is aggressive begging. I mean, it happens. And the city has to work out a way to deal with that properly. But there are a lot of people also that just they want to, they need a place to stay during the day, or it's hot out right now. I mean, it's,
Right.
and so people see people out in the street, or they're, set up in a bus stop. And we just need to work on how we can better support those people in whatever they're dealing with. I mean, there are issues with substance use, there's issues with mental health. um, I some of the independent living centers do get more involved with, mental health. Not I don't think they get as much involved with substance use, but it's part of the disability population. And like you said, it is a concern about institutionalization. And also, I'd seen someone post about this executive order that I know, a lot of the mental health organizations and disability groups were upset about, because it kind of harkens back to ugly laws where, people with disabilities were not allowed to even be outside their homes.
Yeah.
And that's concerning that, you could be someone, who is not someone who has a home, who's just experiencing a mental health crisis, and you could be just institutionalized, just because of the way you're appearing out in public. Or you could be experiencing some other kind of, impact, based on your disability, and, unfairly just taken off the street, which is kind of a scary thing.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see RFK Jr., you don't see Donald Trump have people with disabilities around him. I mean, and I have an assumption that he wouldn't be standing next to Governor Abbott if he didn't have to. So, you know, you talk about, the ugly laws of the past. You don't see non-pretty people in a societal way next to these leaders. And that's a massive problem because, people are varied in their appearance, and disability does
Yeah.
have part of that. And I don't want to be I don't want to be sitting in my house forever. I want to be able to do the things that I want to do. I'm not there. We're not there yet,
Yeah.
but boy, it feels like it's going in that direction, and that's frightening.
Yeah, and I also think I think it is there is a larger representation issue in government. I think with, people with disabilities being in elected office, that has just been, across both parties, that's been an ongoing issue. We've had Jim Langevin, I think, from Rhode Island. I think he's recently retired from the House. We've had Tammy Duckworth in the Senate, and it's kind of unfortunate because we have like one or two of these kind of champions that are people with disabilities, and are carrying a lot of the weight of doing some great disability work down in Washington D.C. But it doesn't really get to the full representation of the percentage of population, somewhere around 20% of people with disabilities across the country. So it doesn't really get on their radar. I think we've been fortunate in the past, with Tom Harkin having, I believe, a brother with a disability. So like,
Yep.
there are some of those family connections, but in terms of, nothing about us without us, I think there's still more that, needs to be done with, disability representation and in government, both, elected office and then also just, holding positions of power within, agencies and departments. That's a really important thing because there it's just not on the radar for people sometimes if they don't have a disability or they aren't really intimately connected with disability in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I've advocated this inside New York State education. There should be more teachers and there should be more administrators with disabilities, visible disabilities, because then you can have more representation, which would then trickle up and out into general society. That's the same fight Judy Human had at the very beginning, and we haven't fixed it. You have
Yeah,
almost no public educators with disabilities
yeah,
at all.
yeah. It's a real challenge. Absolutely.
We got working this past year on New York State subminimum wage efforts, and we all hit a massive roadblock. People have heard me speak about it. Alex, can you give me your perspective and and a little bit of the history of the past 9 months of what we were trying to do?
Right. So there is a bill in New York State to eliminate paying people a subminimum wage. And
People with
that would
disabilities.
people, yes, people with
Yeah,
disabilities specifically. I mean, we're not talking about, tipped employees. There are some, in labor law, there's some other, there's certain jobs where, if you're receiving tips, you might be under minimum wage because you're making that up in tips. But for people with disabilities, we're really talking about people making, a few pennies or quarters. I mean, it's unconscionable. And it really dates back to, thinking from the 1930s, which like, you were saying, back, when we had, you know, um, the Nazis were basically in control of Germany, back in the 30s. So I mean, this dates back to the United States in the 30s, and maybe I think the disability policy, at least in the United States, was not that much better. I think like you said, the euthanasia. We had some policies in the United States in terms of um, people with disabilities not um, being able to have children. They're taking their reproductive rights away um, without any consent because they were trying to basically engage in eugenics,
yeah,
and that kind of informed some of the thinking of the Nazi Party, which is really unfortunate. So that's kind of the time period we're thinking back to is 1930s. So I mean, when you hear there's this federal law from the 1930s that allows people with disabilities to be paid a subminimum wage based on their ev- evaluation to do very kind of menial work, it's really outdated policy. It might have been well intentioned at the time, to get people with disabilities into some kind of employment because there really was not any back in mid 1930, but we're in 2025. I mean, like we're having this meeting like virtually, and we're have computers, and it's a very different time and place, and I'd like to think that we've morally also evolved in terms of how we think about people with disabilities and how we value work. Um, so that's kind of, setting the stage. So it's federal law. A lot of states have eliminated it already. I think we're at like 14 or 15 or
Yeah,
something
it
like
is.
that.
Yep.
So it's, we talk about the governor and some of the elected officials talk about New York State being like a beacon of progressive, progressive policy. And I think this is, an area where we really have kind of fallen behind, unfortunately. And I hope it's just because it hasn't been on the top of their radar, but it's really an unfortunate thing because what we've seen, I mean, there was a study uh, published recently, I think towards the end of last year in the Journal of American Medicine. Um, they studied states like Maryland where they eliminated sub-minimum wage, and they did see an increase of, regular employment for people with developmental disabilities. So, we know that there are opportunities. I mean, that as someone who works in the employment field and with employers, there are a lot more opportunities. There are a lot of employers willing to give people a chance. And it's kind of sad that that has kind of been foreclosed for them because they've been put into these settings where, it becomes a profit center for some of the providers of the services. They can, keep people, um, basically sequestered in their kind of institution, basically, instead of having them go out and be in the community and work a job. Um, so that's something that we've been trying to work on. I know it made it fairly far. You know, we were able to get the support of Senator Fahey, which I really appreciate. We worked really hard with her staff to get something that, was more of a phase-in approach, which, I think, we all recognize that's, it's already been too long. We've all had to live with this, but, we also recognize concerns that, people need to be transitioned from, their current settings. Their adjustments need to be made. I think, we were willing to work with people in good faith on getting this done. And, unfortunately, there were a lot of stumbling blocks one major stumbling block on the assembly, which is really unfortunate. I mean, the bill sponsor in the assembly, Phil Steck, has also been a real champion and
Yeah.
great. And his staff, Dylan, who I would shout out, has really been excellent on this issue and a lot of other disability issues we've working with him. So yeah, shout out to Phil, and I appreciate also, Senator Fahey's work and the bill sponsor, Senator Skoufis, who's long
Senator
been a
Skoufis.
champion
Yeah.
for people with disabilities. So people that don't know, you should know that he really has been an ally in our community.
Yeah, Senator Skoufis, I don't think it's any secret here. He's got plans for himself and the Democratic Party nationally, right? So and thank goodness he's on this issue and many other disability issues, and we appreciate that. And Senator Fahey as well. She's slowly coming around, which I appreciate. Um, you're right. Phil Steck has been fantastic as an assembly member, and I want to give him a shout out. I think that the unfortunate part of this whole thing is that not everybody understands, and B, I think what's worse is there are enough people in the Assembly and the Senate that probably deep down believe people with disabilities can't do the work equal of others, and that's a massive problem. And as I again, it's not my day job, right? My day job is not to lobby and advocate and be involved in state government. I think if it was my day job, I'd be pretty discouraged. So I give you applause for having a smile on your face, Alex, because I don't think I could do that. Um, but it, I we if we have to decide as a society if people with disabilities are the equal of others, and obviously I think that because I am one. Um, but more and more as these policies federally trickle down to the state and local level, it gives people the true opportunity to show their feelings. And that's a massive, massive problem. You talk about eugenics in the 20s. It was funded out of the very rich and wealthy here in the United States who spent money and sent money to Germany just to see what would happen. And well, we saw what happened in the 40s. Um, if you don't think that when F RFK Jr. is talking about eugenics and talking about getting healthy and talking about institutionalization and if you don't think that's the path that we're on, I think you need to check yourself. And if you say to yourself, hey, we'll never go down that road completely. Well, we are going down that road completely. And employment is just one element of this, but it's economic independence is the most important. And it allows me to own a house. It allows me to own a truck. It allows me to have a family. And you know what? I don't lose sight of that. And it's maddening when local and regional politicians in New York State don't see that and don't believe it and don't believe it in their heart. And we're not naming the ones that are that way right now, but boy, I wish we could.
Yeah, I mean, our advocacy is from a 501(c)(3) perspective, and I mean, we're, I'm shouting out those politicians we mentioned before, elected officials, because they really have been good on these issues specifically. And you're right, there are some that have not really been champions in the way they should, which is really unfortunate. Because I think, when they run for office, they probably talk about, like you said, economic independence and, you know, trying to support their neighbors and, a lot of these kind of generalized statements, but they're really leaving people out, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Talk to me a little bit, educate me a little bit on CDPAP. We've if you watch local news, you've seen the wheel-ins or whatever we're doing, um, and a lot of the faces and people that I know and and I've seen you on camera as well, so I know you're there. Um, it's a big issue, and it needs to be fixed. But give us a little bit of history again, Alex. What's going on and what will be going on?
So the state has selected, last year selected as through the budget, they decided they were going to select a single fiscal intermediary, so a single statewide FI basically. Um, and then they went through a selection process. There were, a few firms that bid, and they ended up selecting last year this firm, PPL, Public Partnerships Limited. Um, and so they're a large organization. They, have worked in other states. There has been there have been issues in other states. And there was this, rush transition, which I think a lot of folks in the program are familiar with. I think, from January, it's gotten extended through, advocacy, especially in the courts, which is unfortunate. That, they didn't anticipate that, transitioning hundreds of thousands of people and workers would have taken a little more time. I've heard advocates in, legal services who work specifically on Medicaid, reference other, program transitions in Medicaid that have taken like a full year or 2 years, where the state is very careful and very measured in how they do these transitions in other programs and for other populations. And for some reason for this, it was very accelerated and, not really, anticipating the needs of the consumers and the workers. I think there's a fundamental, fundamental lack of understanding about the history of this program and why it exists and how it came to be, and the importance of, what the FIs that had existed did. Um, a lot of the focus, I think, in the conversations in the news media is on bad actors, but I don't think there was enough discussion about the good actors and, especially, the independent living centers that have worked as fiscal intermediaries and really delivered a kind of a comprehensive, role in terms of supporting people in terms of, when they needed assistance, either recruiting workers or they had issues with paperwork or trainings. I mean, they really were able to provide a level of assistance that I think is kind of lacking in the system. I think, they saw it as kind of just a payroll system, and it really is a lot more than that. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can just computerize and throw in, AI or like, it's really the human communication and the human interaction. And I mean, that's what independent living centers do. Like I said at the outset of this, we do peer connecting and peer support. And I think that, was not translated well into the current system. And it would be great if we could get back to that. The independent living centers are part of, this facilitator role, but I don't think that really fully captures what FIs used to do and did best, the good FIs. So there's still, communication happening. There's, this hearing coming up later this month. I know they are, they only have a limited number of people speaking at the hearing, but they are, accepting written comment. So, if you are listening to this and you're a consumer or a worker and you want to share a written comment, I know they're accepting that. But I mean, I'm sure there are people out there, a lot of them that can share their stories and, communicate to, our elected officials about how this is still an issue, months after, this deadline that was supposed to be,
And
the end of this.
talk to me, give me a human perspective.
Mm.
What is a caregiver doing that is so essential? Because this is what
Right.
and I understand why local networks don't want to actually say what goes on, but
Mhm.
this is essential life function that this funding is supposed to be there for.
Yeah, so I think that is a really important point. So what's interesting about CDPA is that you are training your worker to do intimate care, to do care that traditionally was done by a nurse. You'd have to get, visiting nurse service to come in, and still, if you use licensed home care, they still have some of these requirements where you have to have someone who's licensed come in separately. So it is very intimate care. It is life-saving care. It is the care that keeps us alive. It keeps us going. I know, people that need help with toileting specifically, people that have ventilators or specialized medical equipment that is like, you have to drain your drain special fluids to help you keep breathing. I mean, it's really, I mean, I hear some people say stuff like, "Oh, well, that person could never live in the community." The people that you think can't live in the community, they're living in the community right now, and they're
Yeah.
using programs like this to do it because they couldn't otherwise. Because having that level of care is very intimate, and it is very specialized. The equipment can be very specialized. So it's the person with a disability instructing specifically the worker on, you have to press this button, and then you have to do this, and you have to do that, and it's so individualized and customized, and it's really not one size fits all. And like I said, the peer support, so you could have someone with, maybe a similar disability that can, share tips on how to train workers and things like that. I mean, it's really an amazing program, and it has allowed so many people to live independently.
And again, these are real issues, real people, life and death. That yes, the news channel can show you and me on the steps of the Capitol and holding signs, great, but actually say what's going on and why this is important. Because if you get down to the general public understanding a family member won't be here if this doesn't happen, that's where it gets real. And this is where this becomes full circle. We talked about subminimum wage and institutionalization and CDPAP. Now, the full circle is: do you want us here? Because it's starting to feel like federally, I'm not wanted, but then even in New York State, and that's kind of frightening because yes, in a lot of public comments, we want to be the beacon of disability in the country. But when you get down to it, do we really want to be the beacon of disability in the country? We don't have a threshold of employment for state contractors. We don't do that. We certainly have messed up the CDPAP and the financial structure in the name of cost cutting. Are we supporting our independent livings well enough? And look what we've done with subminimum wage, right? We can't get out of our own way with it because uh, family members have been indoctrinated to think that's all that X person can do. Well, that's not true. It's absolutely not true. And 15 other states have figured it out. So we can't figure it out. If New Hampshire and Vermont can figure it out, why can't we? We say to the world we're better. Well, are we better? So this is where I get frustrated. So I appreciate you putting a human face on it, Alex, because we need more human faces on this.
Absolutely, John. Yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking about this, this quote. I was doing some training that, some other states were providing on emergency preparedness, and one of the first things they shared was that, show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities. And I think that kind of speaks to what you're saying. And it does come down to but unfortunately, it comes down to money sometimes. Like you said, it's, we can stretch, in nonprofits, we can stretch dollars pretty far, but there's a limit, and we're getting there.
Well, I'm gonna tell something I really haven't ever said publicly. I did speak to the governor's office about the chief disability officer position. I'm glad Kim has it. I think the world of Kim Hill, so I'm not going there. But my first question is, what's your budget? How many people can I
Yeah,
hire? And they didn't have an answer. And so now I know they had an answer down the road, but that tells you everything. If there's
yeah,
if there's no budget to do something, you don't care. And
yeah.
and I get worried that that continues to hold over. Now Kim's done a great job in pushing snow uphill here, but um, you know, you don't want it to get lost either, go backwards.
Yeah, I mean, the whole CDO office thing is a really interesting story because it's a bill that we supported for many years, really to create or bring back really that office. And it was originally intended to be an independent kind of office. And so the way it's structured now is kind of an executive position is kind of interesting because, she does report to the governor. I mean, it's good that she's in the governor's office. I hope the governor's listening to her. And she's being prioritized as a voice in the room. I really hope that's the case. But the original intent of the bill was to have a separate entity really in a separate office, like you said, funded with staff. And as part of kind of amendments that happened after the bill was passed, amendments through the executive, we ended up kind of with the CDO office as it is today. I mean, they've been expanding it. They've been adding responsibilities onto it. I know they do some really great work, Kim and her team, and they've added more staff. But I do worry about them getting overwhelmed because they're really, they're being charged with a lot, and I think people are looking to them to do even more. And like you said, I hope they have the budget for that, or they.
Well, budgets tell you, like you said, budgets tell you everything. Just along those lines, I had a meeting recently with Chancellor King at SUNY, and I said, is there a plan to have a chief disability officer for the, State University of New York? And of course, the answer is no. And I said all the reasons why I thought it should happen, and that there needed to be a point person for all things disability at the 60 plus campuses, because if it's not prioritized, then it trickles down to you and me if we're on campus or trying to be employed by a campus to know that we're not important.
Yep.
And it is kind of frustrating when those that should be knowledgeable uh, are lacking in that knowledge, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I know there was an initiative through the executive, I think maybe even executive order about disability hiring and the state agencies and departments, and they were supposed to create, I think, some kind of report out, or at least gathering data on the number of employees with disabilities they have, and kind of tracking that and increasing those numbers. And and that would be, a good example of, where I think, like you said, the federal government is kind of failing now and going in the wrong direction, and maybe New York can, champion that initiative more, and take more of a leadership role in terms of representation of disability. So I think at some point, I think that was on Kim's plate, or they were doing some work on that. But like I said, they've got a lot that they're doing. So
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground. AlexThompson, thank you very much, and I hope we can do this again, because this is the kind of conversation the greater disability community in New York State needs to hear.
absolutely, yeah. And I encourage everyone to get involved. I mean, I am but one voice in what I hope will be a larger and growing choir in terms of getting more disability representation, fighting for our rights. If there's one issue you care about, speak out on it. I mean, I work on a lot of different stuff, but I really am a fan of, people like John that, are really, focusing in employment. And, if there's something that bothers you in your community, don't be afraid to speak up and speak out about it. And there are those of us around that will, support you and be champions.
Amen, Alex. Thank you very
All
much.
right. Thanks, John.